My name is Dr. Patrick Dixon. I'm a futurist and a physician, and over the years I have worked with around 400 of the largest 2,000 companies in the world, advising them on a wide range of global trends affecting every industry and every region. But right now, I've been lecturing primarily on life beyond coronavirus, and these sessions have usually lasted around 25 minutes of formal content, then a Q&A which wraps up after about an hour. But I leave the camera running and I say, look, if you want to join me in a glass of water, a cup of coffee, whatever, you can linger, that's fine. After an hour, I would expect 980 or thereabouts to carry on for at least another half an hour to 45 minutes. Maybe after half an hour, another 20 or 30 have gone. It's the same if you have 450. I expect to be still mobbed by around 420 of them, at least for the next half an hour, 40 minutes. If you have 35 VIP clients on a call from around Europe, then I would expect maybe no more than 2 or 3 to be lost. Why do they stay on? We live in an era where attention span is measured in milliseconds, my friends. So why are they staying on? These are high caliber people, incredibly busy. They have lots of other things to do. They are staying on because it matters to them. The things that they are hearing about are life and death issues for them personally, their families, their businesses, the environment, their whole nations. And they have concerns about their future. They stay on because they are convinced that the content really matters. They stay on because of the conversation that is happening with others in that meeting. So the important thing is this: if you get the content right, virtual engagements, virtual events can be extraordinarily successful, powerful, life-changing. They can enhance your brand and your business and help build a better world. Here, if you want to watch it, is an example of part of a virtual event I did recently. Good morning. I want to look at life beyond coronavirus, and I'm speaking to you as a physician and a futurist. I work as an advisor to around 400 of the largest 2,000 companies in the world, and that includes many of the world's largest banks and financial services, insurance companies, and the rest, helping them to understand what the future will be like. But I started off as a physician, and in my first training, I was looking after people dying of cancer at home in London. And through that, I became aware of a new illness which very much impacted my own medical practice. And that was caused by another mutant virus called HIV, which caused AIDS. And that particular virus, like coronavirus, jumped from animals into humans. We don't know exactly when or how, but it affected 85 million people so far, of which 45 million have died. So we have learned a lot about mutant viruses over many years. And for over 2 decades, I have been warning of the risks of new mutant viruses emerging, just like coronavirus. So let's go on a journey and look at this particular virus, life beyond it, what's going to happen next. And the first thing I'd say is this, that you can't kill a virus, okay? You can only damage it. You can't attack it in a normal way. It's not like a bacteria. It doesn't eat. It doesn't use food. It doesn't have the capacity to reproduce. All it is a bag of protein enclosing a piece of genetic code, that RNA coil you see there in yellow. And on the outer edge is the mechanism the virus uses to latch onto particular cells. And those knobs on the outside are specific to a particular type of creature, whether it's a monkey or a bat or a human, and probably specific to a particular kind of organ. Might be the nose, lung, eye, kidney, skin, whatever. So because you can't kill a virus, you have to say that this is really a robot. It's the ultimate nanotech robot. And once that the tiny bubble of that virus touches a larger bubble, which is one of your own cells, imagine that happening in a bubble bath with some children there, then those 2 bubbles suddenly become one, and the virus own genetic code becomes part of the cell's genetic code, and after that, that cell has been hijacked to become a biotech weapons factory. Now, we don't know how many cases there are of this infection. We think we've detected around 4.3 million, but quite frankly, the reality could be many times that. We think we've detected 291,000 deaths, but again, the numbers could well be double that easily or more. One thing is certain, the US is being hit very hard, Russia also, with a number of other nations not far behind. And the trouble with this virus is that it spreads most rapidly along the relationships between those we love the most, those that we spend the most time with, those that we work most closely with. And we've seen a ferocious doubling time. In London, before lockdown, we saw cases doubling every 2 days. What does that mean? Well, a doubling goes from 2 to 4, from 4 to 8, 8 to 16. It doesn't sound too bad, but in just 10 doublings, you go from 1 case to 1,000. In another 10 doublings, you go from 1,000 cases to 1,000,000 cases. So in 20 doublings, well, if that's happening, if a doubling is happening every sort of 4 to 5 days, which is what it was happening in most parts of the world up until lockdown, then in 20 doublings, with 4 to 5 days per doubling, you'd see in 3 months, 1 case in a country going to 1,000,000, 1,000 cases going to 1,000,000,000. Now, of course, things saturate, the mechanisms slow down, but this is the kind of modeling that produced the decision in so many nations to lock down. But what's happened is varying. If you look at these 3 nations, South Africa, Italy, and the United States, they're all on the same graph, plotted on the first day that they each detected 150 cases. And you can see that despite all the chaos we saw in Italy, that Italy has actually leveled off, whereas the US is really out of control in terms of the pandemic. Now, we're seeing new viruses emerge roughly every 12 months somewhere in the world, usually in Southeast Asia, China, and so on. We don't know why these things should happen most frequently there, but here's just a few new viruses that we have seen. In 2003, we saw the SARS pandemic. Actually, it wasn't quite a pandemic. We got it early enough, and there were only 8,600 cases, but 860 died. In 2003, the same year, we saw bird flu with 60% mortality rate. Most of these new viruses are so dangerous that they die out because the virus kills people more rapidly than the virus can spread. In 2009, swine flu, we saw the opposite. We saw a relatively low mortality rate, but highly infectious, and we saw half of the world's children infected in just 12 months and a quarter of the entire world's adults. In 2012, we saw a MERS epidemic with 34% mortality rate. And in 2019, COVID-19, we're seeing maybe 1% around that are dying. This is a really big issue. It's not just coronavirus. It is that we have a great vulnerability to all types of viruses. Indeed, coronavirus itself is mutating. We think that there have been maybe 30 slightly different strains already since January, certainly 2 or 3 main ones. And some research suggests that some of these viruses may be much more likely to produce high levels of virus in the blood than others, which might explain a little bit of the big differences in spread patterns between nations. We've studied coronaviruses for quite a long time. There's just only one type of viruses of the viruses that we see emerging in different parts of the world every year. And one of the problems with coronaviruses is that we don't usually see long-lasting immunity with them. At the moment, it looks like we are seeing a decent immune system reaction, which means hopefully that people won't get the same virus infection more than once, but we don't know that. And there are problems, therefore, for vaccine technology. Now, as I predicted, we've seen the language change in terms of what governments are talking about, and it's becoming increasingly militaristic, which is absolutely appropriate because we are in a global war. And if you understand the language of war and the history of war, then you will be able to predict what government policy is likely to be. So governments are increasingly talking about things like this: fighting our enemy on every front, mobilizing our whole nation, protecting the most vulnerable, taking good care of casualties, maintaining morale and community life, and being confident in victory. So if you use the picture of war, you understand that when the first load of missiles come over the horizon and it causes massive damage and many casualties, that you put your whole population into underground bunkers and you keep them safe until we've understood a little bit more what these missiles are, how to predict where they're flying around, how to protect ourselves. But you can't keep a nation at war in bunkers forever. To fight, you have to find a way to survive. And that means coming out of bunkers, being careful how we work, but nevertheless, making a decision that for the well-being of the whole nation, that we go back to work somehow, even though there may be risks in doing so, for the greater good, which is the survival of the entire nation, indeed, of humankind, while also protecting the most vulnerable, taking the best care we can of people who get sick, but looking at the same time to build morale and help people to see that there is life beyond COVID-19. Now, the reason why the language of war is important is because it helps you to understand what central banks are going to do. In a time of war, central banks say, whatever it takes, we will do it. If we have to print money, we will. If we have to build up government debt, we will, because this is war. And that is what we're seeing central banks doing. They're making statements that they will do whatever it takes. Therefore, you can expect a lot more quantitative easing and steps like that, a lot more printing of cash to pay for what is necessary in the short term, even at risk of stoking up future inflation. You will see a lot more government borrowing. You will see a lot more attention to fighting deflation rather than fear of inflation. And when this is over, as it will be, you will see at least 10-year overhang from that point on government spending, pressures on government spending, with all kinds of returning arguments about austerity and the rest. Now, the truth is that the pandemic will be dominated not by what happens in America or the whole of the European Union, but by what happens in the 85% of the world, which we call emerging markets. And that is where you will see tremendous challenges, but also some surprises. 85% of the world live there, but many of these nations have relatively young populations. Now, China is, of course, a hybrid. It's emerging in part and developed in part. But you compare that to, let's say, parts of Kinshasa or Nairobi even, as you heard about earlier in the session just now, you can't generalize and say this is how the pandemic will run. I can tell you that in the most remote parts of Kenya, there are no resources really to prevent spread through things like permanent lockdown for 6 months. You cannot do it. You can't do it on the streets of Calcutta. Whatever you try and do, you can have whatever army and police out you like, but the population will still have to live, and it's very crowded and very poor in many parts. So what's going to happen in those kinds of nations is you're going to see rapid spread, uncontrolled spread like what's happening in London before lockdown. But it will be often in a much younger population, because there are less people in countries like Uganda with thick medical notes that are the age of 85. And we know that fortunately, this particular virus does not hit young children and babies, unlike many of the other mutant viruses I've mentioned. What a catastrophe it would be, in addition to what we have, if we were seeing the corpses of tiny young children being brought out onto the streets every day in many nations. Now, coronavirus, this particular virus, 25% of people will have no symptoms at all, which makes it impossible to track fully, even if you have all kinds of technology. 50% of those infected get only mild symptoms, but 25% will suffer greatly. Most of them will manage to soldier on at home, and they will just about cope. But maybe 10% will land up in hospital. and half of those who go into intensive care will never come out. And those that do come out, many of them will have maybe 10 years knocked right off their life expectancy, permanent damage to their lungs, their kidneys, their hearts, and so on. This is a really serious illness. And when you come back to how we tackle it, you can see that nations are confused. Yes, we can talk about all kinds of different responses, but getting those right and the correct point to pivot from one type to another type of response is a really big challenge. No one knows the answers here. And it's no good pointing to a nation that apparently has succeeded in stamping out the infection. All it means is they still have 99.9% of their population incredibly vulnerable because there are no antibodies there to protect them, and that could hit them again at any time. Now, we can test suspect cases. Yes, you can do that with contact tracing and isolation, but you can only do that with tiny numbers of cases each day because of the huge effort needed just from one single new infection. You can do social distancing and lockdown and masks, and all of those things are absolutely vital, but you can't do that with the whole population forever. You can ramp up healthcare, yes, and try to manage the flow of people as they become sick. You can develop better supportive measures, develop new and better treatments. You can try and test people for past infection. We hope we can do that, and then release them back into the community, hoping very much that they won't get infected again. And of course, all attention is on vaccines. But listen, it took 5 years to develop a vaccine against Ebola. Against SARS in 2003, we never managed it. Against AIDS, we've been trying to find a vaccine against HIV for 32 years, and we're still 15 years away from an effective vaccine. So don't bet your entire future, if you're a government leader, on a vaccine. We need to look at other ways. And in the meantime, we're seeing already that after 12 weeks, you can have a nation on its knees economically. So we're seeing a big debate about how to manage our way out. And that means putting a ring of steel around the most vulnerable. It means allowing the youngest and the most immune or the most well-defended to go back to normal much more quickly, and making sure that we get the most important parts of our economy working again. Now, in New Zealand, they cracked down on international travel very quickly. They have almost no cases as of today. And with strong data and low cases, we could see them out of lockdown very quickly. Mid-range nations, however, can have surprises. Singapore thought they had brilliant control, and then suddenly they had a flood of cases through migrant workers, densely packed communities, low income, rapid spread. Be very careful as you come out of lockdown. Then we have nations with high numbers and poor data. I include both Uganda probably and the United States in that. But inside nations, we have nations within nations. We have communities within communities. Don't think of China as only one place. Think of it as 50 nations, if you like, inside one nation. And you will see different types of policy and strategies developed for different towns and cities in many nations around the world as they try to find a way through. Now, the real issue is this. We could find a cure, well, not a cure, but we could find a vaccine for coronavirus, for COVID-19 disease, and you might think it's all over. And then there's another new virus, and we once again have nothing in the cupboard, no medicines that work, and we have to start all over again to try to find a vaccine. You can't live like this. What COVID-19 has shown us is how much we have neglected basic antiviral research. To me, as a physician, it is absolutely shocking that 80 years after the discovery of penicillin, we still have not found a single drug that is as effective against viruses like coronavirus as penicillin was against many different bacteria. So we need to catch up. We need to do 80 years of research in 6 months. We need to find new drugs that are as powerful as penicillin was, to do things like block the cell surface receptors to prevent those virus particles latching onto the outside of your cells. When the RNA gets inside a cell, we need to block the gene translation of the RNA into the brain of the cell. We need to find ways to block the virus from manufacturing new virus particles. We need to find new ways to block the virus release. And actually, we also need to find ways to stop the virus from producing what we call a cytokine storm. It's when the immune system goes completely berserk trying to fight the virus and destroys all kinds of healthy tissue in the same firestorm. These are the things that we need. And when we find them against coronavirus, as we will also find a new range of tools that may help us with the next wave of mutant viruses. But people say, okay, I get all of that, but what does it mean for big trends? What does it mean for big banking? What does it mean for the future of aviation? And what I'd say is this: I've written 17 books on the future, and I've made long-range predictions which largely turned out to be correct. And I'd say this, that the biggest trends that have dominated and shaped our world for the last 40 years will endure. The timing of those trends will, however, be altered in many cases. Enduring trends are the rise of Asia, the rise of emerging markets, the fall of technology costs, the aging of developed nations in China, big data, the Internet of Things, cloud, AI, robotics. None of these things will go into reverse. None of these things will suddenly disappear because of COVID-19. But things like virtual working accelerated, virtual learning accelerated, e-commerce accelerated, Industry 4.0, shorter supply chains, consolidation of airlines. That's a good example. In the United States, we've seen a well-trailed trend, which is massive consolidation of airlines to only 4 or 5 large ones today. But in Europe, we've seen the opposite, with a proliferation of budget airlines without losing some of the large players. So we are over-airlined in Europe. And as a result of this pandemic, we will see a shakeout, and we will see a smaller number of players, larger players in future. In retail, we've seen the acceleration of existing trends. So in many EU nations before the pandemic, 70% of retail was already captured by just 8 companies. But I would say that process is being accelerated globally, of consolidation, big supply chains, and mass move, of course, to e-commerce. Mobile devices were already being used to pay around $640 billion a year, growing at 40% annually. That was before the coronavirus pandemic. Does that go into reverse? No. Is it going to carry on at the same pace? No. Will it be accelerated? Of course. The same with non-banking payment platforms. Yes, they were already there. Are they going to do well? Yes, they are. The coronavirus has given massive acceleration to just about any form of wireless payments, cashless payments, e-commerce, people who can deliver product from a factory without it having to go into a shop, and so on. And we're seeing the same in manufacturing, with a rapid acceleration of investment in global and mobile controls. Okay, those investments are on hold today because people are conserving cash, but I promise you, the moment the pressure is off, many of my manufacturing companies will be investing more than they expected to get themselves fit for the next generation of risks. And that means shorter global supply chains, regional supply chains, and it means an emphasis on agility, creativity, dynamic decision-making, and an emphasis on managing accelerating cyber risks, especially because of this home working, which has multiplied the number of targets that we have to look at. So what it all means is that our post-coronavirus world, what does it mean? It means that we will see life beyond coronavirus. We will see a way of managing lockdown more creatively and dynamically with all kinds of technologies to help us, we will see for sure a whole range of new medical advances that help people to live better and longer if they get coronavirus badly, and hopefully keeps them out of hospital as well. We will see huge improvements in vaccine technology and all kinds of ways to stimulate the immune system so that if you get hit by this coronavirus, it doesn't hit you so hard. We will see all kinds of tools which will make us more resistant to future viral pandemics as a species. We will see greater resilience, ingenuity, and agility in every part of corporate decision-making in the future. We will see greater investment in all kinds of products and services that help us use our life and our time better at home rather than always having to go out and travel. And we will see a more thoughtful and a more compassionate world, I believe, than we have had. We will see greater sensitivity, as we've seen with the clearing of our skies and the better environment in cities. We will see even greater debate about sustainability. How can we live together in a more responsible way for future generations? So all of those things are going to happen. But don't lose the plot. Those big trends on which you built your strategy for the last 10 or 15 years will very largely endure. And I'm pleased to say that as a result of all the stress testing that followed the last financial crisis in 2009, you will see very few banks fail in the kind of ways that we saw before. We have tremendous resilience as a result of all these regulatory measures that were introduced in the banking system in general, and the fundamentals of the global economy remain intact. With the banking crisis, the very nature of financial services came under pressure. But here, the pressure has come from a virus. It's not that there's anything else fundamentally wrong. You might say, well, the virus is pretty fundamental. That's true, but the virus will come through a nation, and eventually its major impact will be gone. And when that happens, you will find all kinds of pent-up demand. Those who have remained in work are on the whole saving money. Why? Because they're not able to do things that they would normally spend money on. And there's a limit to how many Netflix movies you can order and watch. There's a limit to how many new clothes you need in a home when you never go out. There's a limit to how many spare parts you need on a car when you're never driving it. When lockdown ends, there are all kinds of people, millions and millions of them, who will have pent-up frustrations, things that they want to do, things that they have been waiting to do, and they will have the cash to do. They may not spend it exactly as they would have done in the past. So, for example, those who have saved money will may have paid down some of their mortgages. If they're young married couples with families, for example, they may not go out and spend 5 holidays in a row. They may go out and have a big holiday, but they may decide instead to extend their house, to enlarge it, to make it a better place to live. There are all kinds of shifts of finance that will go on. And watch out for those that will make billions of dollars out of the crisis. And they will. Not by supplying masks and all that kind of thing. Some may make money from that, but the real money will be made by those with cash at the expense of those who have run out. And I'm talking, for instance, about one of my clients who makes cars and was saying that his supply chains have been massively disrupted because some of his supply companies are going bust. He doesn't know they will be around. I said to him, I guarantee most of them will be. The question is simply who will own them? Because if you've got a beautiful company that is a world leader in making, let's say, a particular gadget that controls, let's say, automatic braking systems, then you can be sure that someone will come along. If that company goes bust, they'll be saying, we've got a full order book, but we just can't survive. We know we will have lots of orders next year, but we cannot survive now. What will happen is someone will come along and say, you're a fantastic company. I love your management. I love your technology. I love your innovation. I love your culture. It is my duty to rescue you. And I'm happy to partner with you to do whatever it takes to enable you to survive, but on one condition. And the condition is, of course, that a huge amount of the ownership of the company will move from the people who used to own it to the person who's now going to put up the money. That's what's going to happen. And when those companies recover, and they will, those individuals who have had the cash, the liquidity to do it, will make a huge return. Now, I'm talking about investment funds as well. I'm talking about venture capital. I'm talking about pension funds. I'm talking about all kinds of creative ways to mobilize cash out of things like stocks and shares and airlines into things that will be massively discounted, that will then make a great return in the future. But don't forget about the airlines. There's money to be made in airlines as well, because why? Because all kinds of things happen when cash runs out. All kinds of things become available for almost nothing that will one day have greater value. And it could well be, for example, planes themselves getting snapped up for almost nothing by people who are rescuing, providing cash for people who are desperately need to get rid of those bits of aviation real estate. So watch this space. All kinds of extraordinary things will happen in terms of changes in ownership. At the same time, a society reconstructing itself. So we will have a future. We're not going to see, I don't think, hyperinflation or anything like that as a result of these stimulatory measures. I think central banks are much too cautious for that. But we will see a future, life beyond coronavirus, and it will be quite profoundly different in some ways, because the future is not so much about events, it's about emotional reactions to them. And the emotional reactions to this particular pandemic will endure and scar a generation. So I wish you well as you puzzle all these things out for your own teams, your own lives, your own families. But let's look at the bigger picture and not just the headlines, because the headlines are very confusing, quite frankly. Thank you very much.